Thank you. Welcome back to inquiry into Drug, Poison and Controlled Substance Amendment Act, Bill 2023. Joining us for this session is Dr. Patrick Keyzer and Mr. Richard Kane. Gentlemen, just before we continue, I just want to quickly read the information relating to the evidence you're going to provide. All evidence taken is protected by a parliamentary privilege as provided by the Constitution Act 1975 and further subject to the revision of the Legislative Council standing orders. Therefore, the information provided during this hearing is protected by law. You are protected against any action for what you say during this hearing, but if you go elsewhere and repeat the same thing, those comments may not be protected by this privilege. Any deliberately false evidence or misleading of the committee may be considered contempt of Parliament. All evidence is being recorded. You will be provided with a proof version of the transcript following the hearing. The transcript will ultimately be made public and posted on the committee website. Just for recording purposes, will you please state your full name and organisation you're with, please?
Yes, Richard Keen, Living Positive Victoria.
And Dr. Patrick Keyzer, Reparation Legal.
Again, thank you for coming in and welcome, gentlemen. Due to time, I know you've made a submission. I'd like to ask you to make an opening statement. Will you please keep it short, to the point, and because anything we already in submission, we already got it on a table. Thank you.
Terrific.
Please.
All right. First of all, thank you for the invitation to come along and your interest in our submission, and inviting me to come along and speak on behalf of people living with HIV in Victoria. Living Positive Victoria is a non-for-profit community-based organisation representing all people living with HIV in Victoria since 1988. As somebody who was diagnosed at the age of 19 in 1989, prior to effective treatments, cannabis was really key to a lot of people prior to having access to effective treatments to alleviate some of the side effects and significant health implications due to HIV. And although treatments have got a whole lot better over years, we still have a group of people, particularly heterosexual men and women, often diagnosed very, very late and left with lifelong issues. I myself have peripheral neuropathy from the 7 years that I had without access to effective treatments. And my GP at the time wrote me a script for cannabis, said, obviously you can't go out and fill it, but if you do have a situation where you're caught with cannabis on you, you're using it for a medical reason, it may alleviate some of the criminality that you might face if this situation happens. So right from the very beginning, there's been a very strong history, and that's now kind of backed up by a whole range of data and evidence. But what we also see too is, despite people living really, really well, ongoing issues like background inflammation impact people living with HIV. We have much higher incidences of cancers than the general population in the community. And many people still see cannabis as a really important support to prescription medications and alleviating some of the things around polypharmacy, drug interactions, adding more and more pills to treat different conditions or to treat side effects of other conditions as well. And we just feel that this is the time to kind of have this conversation, and we're really, really pleased that this has gone forward. Just a couple of things, and I will make it brief because I am very aware of the time, and I'm sure you'll ask me specific questions if you have them. We feel that this bill potentially has aspects that mean some people may remain criminalised, particularly around where people can smoke. For example, if you're smoking in your own home and other things like that, if you don't have the privilege of secure property and home ownership, if you're in a rental situation, if you're in public housing, are you able to kind of safely consume cannabis under this bill? Or will you be potentially excluded and criminalised as a result of that? So just a couple of key things. And we also think that this is an opportunity, even though we're talking about a specific bill, to look a bit further and think about the legalisation of cannabis across the state. And we look at the economic drivers of those things. We look at the state of the Victorian economy, a whole range of other things, and particularly cuts in health. Living Positive Victoria and other organisations like us have received significant funding cuts over recent times and a whole range of things, and we believe the potential of revenue raising via the legalisation of cannabis and putting that back into really strong health systems would be a potential thing to think of into the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Doctor?
Oh, thanks very much. Just a couple of quick things, and then when we talk, I might refer to my submission and add some footnote references to that. The first point I'd like to make is that wastewater analysis unequivocally demonstrates that there's widespread use of cannabis in Australia. And so deterrence obviously hasn't worked. The wastewater evidence speaks for itself. Cannabis use is widespread, but we're taking an approach that doesn't address its use at all in any legitimate way. We're not addressing the health issues, we're only criminalising. So that's the first point. Second point, I was here for the earlier evidence of the people from Fitzroy Legal Service and found myself nodding and nodding. Based on my own experience as a lawyer over 30 years, I've found that low-level cannabis possession and use offences are very common for criminalised populations. And it's not just the convictions for possession and use, it's the compounding effect and the ripple effect that has on steps into the criminal justice system. So often before a person is given a custodial sentence here in Victoria or in other states or territories of Australia, they may have a number of different smaller or small to moderate criminal offence convictions, and cannabis possession and use could be one or a number of those, but it's the compounding effect on the sentencing discretion of the magistrate or the intermediate court judge. That if someone's got convictions, they have to take them into account, and more convictions, more likely you're going to get a custodial sentence. And previous speakers have spoken eloquently about the turnstile effect of recidivism in our criminal justice system. And it's something that we should really try and avoid. And alcohol and drug services could be funded with the money that we're currently spending on criminal arrests. So that's the second point I'd make. I guess the third point I'd make, and here I might differ a little bit with my friend, but I think we're all travelling in the same direction, is I think it's really important that my reading of this bill is it's not creating a commercial market, right? There's no sale, so there's no opportunity for the creation of a commercial market with this legislation. It's about use at home by people growing their own marijuana, and for similar reasons, there's no real ripple effects into the legal issue or the policy issue of driving. When I'm sitting at home, I don't need to drive in my car to get home. I'm at home, so there's no driving involved. And I think one of the strong features of this step into decriminalisation is its emphasis on home use. It's not about smoking in public, as it were. Although I do recognise what Mr. Keynes said a moment ago about the need for us to think about people who live in housing precarity. So, that was, quite frankly, that was a point that I hadn't considered that I really should have in making my submission. So, I hope you let me adopt that point you made. Yeah. I guess the fourth and final point I'd make before stopping talking. Make two more points. The fourth point of my two remaining points is the ACT has now published research on what's happened there. I have this paper, which I'm happy to hand to the committee. It was published in Scientific Reports, which is one of the Nature journals. So it's published by Nature, so a significant scientific journal. And it was published in 2025, so it's hot off the press. And it talks about the ACT experience. And I was struck by the material accompanying footnotes 12, 13 and 14, which are rates of cannabis use and cannabis-related hospitalisations appear unchanged. I mean, I think that's a very significant public health finding by some significant public health researchers in a significant public health journal. And I think it's something that the committee should certainly take into account. I guess my final point is I'm not sure if I gave you the final version of my submission, it looks like the last sentence in paragraph 7 sort of trails off, and but the sentence didn't go for very much further. So you haven't missed out on much. That's all I have to say.
We'll continue in suspense.
Thank you. I'll really start off a question, then I'll open up to my colleague. Just from your comment lesson to the amount of usage, public use of cannabis, and it doesn't seem to work. And I think early submissions, early evidence provided that similar aspect, like I said, the term's not working. From your background as a lawyer and what you currently research at the moment, legalising cannabis, should we, because society is evolving at the moment, not only cannabis, it's growing use of cannabis, but also party drugs and other stuff are actually populating at a volume as well. And pill testing, it's in action at the moment. Should the government also explore other substances and other drugs as well in legal legalisation from your own personal experience as a lawyer and research?
Well, thanks for the question. I should also indicate that I'm also a professor of law and public policy and have been for almost 30 years. So, but I'm also a lawyer. I'm here in my private capacity, but I happen to have that expertise as well, if that's useful. Look, I've at different times in my career engaged in comparative law study and comparative policy study. And I think there's a real risk in this policy and legal environment for all of us, even experienced researchers, to say, oh, well, this happens in Canada, so it will happen here, or this happens in Thailand, so it will happen here, and that sort of thing. And comparative lawyers and comparative policy scholars will tell you you've actually got to be really, really careful when you do that to make sure that the comparator that you're selecting is as close as humanly possible. And we just happen to be in a situation where this bill is almost identical to the ACT bill, and the ACT has got science. So as a matter of comparative law and public policy, we couldn't be in a better position to make a comparison than being in the Victorian Legislative Council right now, looking at the experience of another jurisdiction which has been as published as recently as this week. So we really are in a wonderful position to reach really quite firm conclusions about what will happen. There's one other aspect of the legislation that I'll mention, and then I'll come to your question.
Sorry, I just don't want to jump in.
Sure.
The question is basically regarding, should the government also, mind you, are doing cannabis, but mind you, the recommendation from other evidence today were other substance as a drug. So my question is to you, in your opinion and your research.
Well, I guess my response to that is given that we've got this comparator, I don't think we're in a position to look at this bill and say, we don't have a bill in front of us. So we're working with a particular bill on a particular issue. And my own view, for what it's worth, is one drug at a time, because they're very different. So cannabis tends to be consumed at home. It's not like a party drug where people go to music festivals and they want to do pill testing. It's a different kind of, it's a different vibe. And then again, other drugs are quite different. I mean, one of the things that's clear from the wastewater analysis of drug use is that there's a lot of meth use, right? And meth is quite a different drug to cannabis, completely opposite effects. And I think different regulations required. So I think it's really important for us to not necessarily lump all drugs in together. And so my recommendation, coming to your question, is one drug at a time.
Thank you. Suppose Tom, I'll quickly pass on to.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, both, for joining us. I actually want to jump straight into what you were just discussing there, Mr. Keyzer. Sorry, Dr. Keyzer.
Yeah, you're right.
Comparative law. So we are looking at the ACT model. I was actually reading that study on the train in this morning. Very encouraging. We are very similar jurisdictions, but there are some significant differences between a state like Victoria and a territory of the ACT, different demographics, different history of drug legislation as well. in implementing this model, if we were to do so, how do we ensure that we are not falling into any pitfalls? What do we need to be mindful of, and what do we need to be doing so that we do get the same results?
Well, look, I think the feature of this legislation that gives me the most confidence that you will avoid any pitfalls, if there are any, in the ACT model, is the fact that it's got a sunset clause, right? So part of the beauty of this legislation is it's a trial for a year. So what you could do is you can make it a trial for a year or two. That's a matter for all of you, and then you make an assessment.
Yep.
So I think that's actually this is really an exceptionally modest decriminalisation step. In the grand scheme of decriminalisation efforts, this is really a modest step, but it's actually really well designed from a public policy perspective. So I think the sunset clause really gives me confidence that you and all of your colleagues will be able to make an assessment. And of course, you've got the benefit of, as you said, you read this study on the way in, you've got the benefit of knowing which scientists to go to replicate the work that they've done in the ACT in Victoria. And then if, picking up on your comment, Mr. Galea, if there are some differences that you would be familiar with more than me because you're a Victorian parliamentarian, then you can talk to the scientists about those differences and you can integrate those additional factors into the analysis so you don't fall into the comparative policy trap that we were talking about before.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
Mr. Keane, I'll ask questions of you just for the time I have. You were talking about public place exemption. Just to clarify, is your view that it should be permitted to smoke cannabis in all public spaces or in just certain areas?
No, just ensuring that it's equitable.
And equitable for those people in public housing?
Absolutely.
Yeah, sure, thank you. I know, and there is a slight disparity in terms of your advocacy for the regulated commercial model.
Absolutely, totally get it.
And you spoke about the revenue benefits in particular. Now, I will be upfront and say we've been mostly focusing on the ACT model, so I haven't gone as much into this. My understanding, though, is that those revenue and taxation benefits would mostly flow to the Commonwealth. Would that be your understanding as well?
Yes, but that can also be distributed down through health, health and other conversations that go on at the federal with COAG and a whole range of other services, which mean that there would be more money on the table to respond to health in particular.
So it feed into those conversations about that distribution and making sure that if, whether at Victoria or another state, were to go down that model, that obviously those conversations would have to take place to make sure of the equitable return of support. Yeah, thank you. And just lastly as well, I was very interested in your personal experiences with treating it for HIV, treating HIV with cannabis. Now that we do have medicinal cannabis, what's the interaction that you see? Is there a large number of people who would be able to use this who aren't otherwise captured by the current regulations?
I think so, because even though medical cannabis is available, again, it's about the equitable access to it. So first of all, you have to find a GP that's going to support you to have medical cannabis for a range of side effects. I was talking about peripheral neuropathy before, and it's something that I've kind of had to deal with as a long-lasting side effect. I've been offered opiate-based pain relief. And when you kind of weigh that up against the potential of cannabis, I'm someone who's literate. I can access things via my computer. I can do all those kinds of things. But there's a whole range of people that may not have that skill set. Yeah. So even if you're not getting that access to medical cannabis via a GP, everybody knows that online there's these huge kind of industries that are kind of already there, and we're talking about legalisation. They kind of already exist. Around 300,000 Australians access medical cannabis over a range of different organisations, and you go there, and if you're literate and you've got enough money and you can do all that kind of stuff, you can access it anyway. And I just think that this is a far more equitable way of ensuring that people have access to those things instead of just traditional medicines, which can sometimes be, if we're talking about addiction and we're talking about outcomes and physical outcomes, sometimes quite a little bit more scary than dealing with cannabis.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.
Thank you, Michael. Spain?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to you both for your submission and for presenting before us today. One of the key differences between the bill that's before us here in Victoria and the ACT model is the ability to gift cannabis. And I note in your submission, Dr. Keyzer, that you acknowledged that. But I'd also love to hear from Richard about experiences with that, because what we've heard from some of the contributors to this inquiry is there's concern around gifting, and I feel as though it's something where it is quite common practice within the cannabis community.
It is, and the other thing that I'd like to kind of emphasise too and give a historical note to, in those days prior to effective treatments, our community used to come together and we'd go and block purchase illegally large amounts of cannabis and distribute that amongst our community. So there was already sharing in resourcing and other things like that. So I think that aspect of the bill is a really important one to consider. It allows people to kind of step out if they have ongoing use for cannabis, whether that's personal use or medical use, to get out of engaging with illegal elements that they sometimes have to engage with for that kind of stuff. And limiting the amount I think is good too. But I also think that opportunity for people to get together and to share cannabis, they might grow their plants at a different time of year, might be a whole range of things that they can kind of come to an agreement about, and kind of that kind of shared community is, I think, a real benefit of this bill.
The only thing I'd add to that is I think that the cannabis community has built-in quality control. One of the interesting things about the ACT analysis, and it's there in the tables, is most of the cannabis is low THC or moderate THC content, and it can happen that people have high THC products, and it may be something that some people don't want to repeat. So the advantage of gifting is people are able to share, hey, this is good, it works for my insomnia, perhaps you might like to try it.
Absolutely.
So that gifting creates that community which looks out for each other. And it's the same really, quite frankly, with alcohol once people turn 18. People will try different drinks and then they'll find what drink works for them. It's really no different. It's a community. You have your community, usually people that you went to school with or people that you have other reasons for being friendly with, and you all look out for each other and help each other make decisions. Yeah.
Thank you. Also in your submission, Dr. Keyzer, you talk about the bill has the potential to really reduce that illicit market.
Yeah.
Would you like to expand more on those sort of on that commentary? And Richard, I would love for you to contribute to that as well.
Yeah. Well, look, the best research that's available on the size of the shadow market for cannabis is the work that's been done in New South Wales for a couple of years ago by the Crime Commission, I think. And it estimated the size of the shadow market to be worth billions of dollars. And so if you extrapolate for demographics and use long division, you'd really be looking at a shadow market in Victoria of about $500 million a year. Now at the moment, cannabis is it's a place where organised criminal networks can be involved. It's big business, but it's big illicit business. One of the really positive features of this bill is that it lets the air out of that tyre, because basically it means that the size of that market will shrink because people are supplying their own cannabis from growing themselves, gifting, sharing until they get the strains that are right for them, and it will mean that the criminal networks have less of a market to exploit. At the moment, people are being exploited in that market. They're being criminalised in that market, and it's creating an industry that we'd really prefer not to have in Victoria. Yeah.
Thank you. Before going, I just want to make a comment, listen to you openly make a suggestion that trying different drinks is similar to trying different products and cannabis with different THC.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit different between alcohol, different type of alcohol, and different type of cannabis with high level or low level THC. I don't think the comparison there.
Chair, I think that may be outside of the scope of your role as chair,
Yeah.
commentary on
I'll just,
Probably
don't want to
yes,
interrupt you,
Bill,
Paul.
so-
Yeah,
I just, I know you, Mike.
No, I understand. I understand that perspective, but when a person walks into a pub at their when they turn 18, just a bit of a rite of passage in Australia, it's going to be Carlton Draft, or it's going to be Scotch, or it's going to be wine, or it's going to be something, and let's not kid ourselves. Children drink alcohol illicitly, but for a lot of them, they're going to be experimenting, and they're going to be relying on their community of friends to give them advice about, oh no, don't drink that, it's terrible, and I had a really bad experience drinking that. So I actually think the analogy is fair, but I also have learned, because I'm old, that not everybody shares my opinions about things. So.
Dave?
Thank you.
That's a good learning. I've learned that too.
I can introduce you to some Sauvignon Blanc weed or some tequila weed. And, Dr. Keyzer's comments will demonstrate their veracity. Dr. Keyzer, the gifting.
Yeah.
When we were in Canberra, the police there sort of expressed they were totally supportive of the legislation,
Yep.
said that their fears were completely unfounded. The one thing where they did express some concern about what we're proposing was in the context of gifting and the potential for that to be blur the lines
Yeah.
with dealing.
Yeah.
Could I ask if you've got any thoughts on whether that's actually an issue with the legislation?
Well, I think the legislation, in a sense, doesn't touch on dealing. So it doesn't purport to change the criminal law, which makes dealing a criminal offence, right? So in a sense, it's like two ships passing the night. This legislation doesn't touch that issue. It's still a criminal offence and can still be prosecuted. I guess the other point I'd make is I think that one of the earlier speakers, I think it was one of the people from Fitzroy Legal Service, was talking about the level of discretion in policing. Now, I think policing is a very difficult job, and it's not something that I could do personally. I know that police go into lots of difficult situations, and it's a high-stress job, and I admire their courage. But I guess, because I've been practicing for 30 years, I have seen situations where the amount of discretion that a police officer can have can be problematic for them, but also for the people who may be the subject of the arrest. And I think the example that the person from Fitzroy Legal Service gave of, a police officer coming to a place to investigate family violence and then seeing, cannabis paraphernalia and then making an arrest for that. And that makes it very difficult for that person who's trying to prevent family violence from getting the justice that they need. So I guess my response, it's kind of a long-winded response to the gifting point. But I see gifting as like possession, as an activity which simply should not be criminalised. And in many jurisdictions around the world, it's not. I think, given that this legislation doesn't touch the issue of commercial dealing, and it's still a legal offence to sell marijuana, I think that the gifting clauses in this bill are really a sensible expression of reality. Because one of the problems with the ACT legislation is no gifting, and another problem is no seeds. So, there's an air of unreality. How do you grow a plant without a seed? I mean, it just, there's...
Fortunately, we don't have to resolve metaphysics here.
Yes, yeah. So I see it as another low-level activity which really shouldn't be criminalised.
And it's also happening already across a range of chronic illness communities, cancer folks and people living with Parkinson's and a whole range of other things. Someone will grow some, someone will say, look, you know, this has worked for me, here you go, try a cookie, whatever it is. Those things are already existing out in the community in really tangible ways.
Yeah.
Could I just
And also
raise one
veterans
question there? I
communities.
just, Richard, I guess I'm interested because I think it's wonderful you're here today because it brings together in two aspects of a key issue for us, which is around stigmatisation.
Yeah.
And clearly there's a huge amount of stigmatisation within the HIV community.
There is, yeah.
And there's a huge amount of stigmatisation associated with cannabis.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you could just share with the committee your thoughts on what that means in terms of a health-led response where you've got effectively double stigmatisation.
Yeah, I think intersectional stigma plays a really big part in people, the outcomes that they have, some of the risks that they might take, a whole range of other things like that. But I think the importance of understanding the impacts of multiple stigmas is really important when we consider this issue. The stigma of somebody living with HIV may mean that, again, like you were saying, in a certain setting, if there's a legal problem or other things like that, they come up against it, there may be stigma around that HIV without that person even knowing it, even though it has no bearing on any legal situation as well. And so I think it is a really important thing to consider.
Thank you.
Dr. Heath?
Thank you so much, and thank you both for your submissions and also presenting and telling your personal story. Really appreciate that. I've just got a question around safety. So when we're talking about different levels of THC and things like that and people gifting cannabis, when we think about alcohol, there's sort of guidelines in what a standard drink is. Is there anything like that with cannabis? Like, what is a standard dose? And how do we keep people, like, to me, that could pose some risk. Do you understand what I'm saying there? I just want a bit of clarity around what a standard dose would be and how you can sort of ensure that.
Yeah. Do you want to answer that? Or look, I'm a legal expert, not a health expert. But the ACT study, which has just been published, does talk about this issue. And the findings of the ACT study are that people are using low or moderate THC cannabis in the ACT. So that is, pretty solid data that low THC products are being smoked and moderate THC products. So, people aren't going for high THC products, right? So I think we've got a data set there around people self-medicating, as it were, or self-dosing, perhaps is a more accurate description. As with alcohol, as a young person, you typically will experiment with things and work out what works for you and what doesn't, So by the time you have children, you're not hard drinking every night, because you need to get up and not be the Prince of Darkness in the morning. So a glass or two of wine is something that you might feel is the right amount of dose. And I think it's important to recognise that people are using cannabis in Australia and they're using cannabis in Victoria. It's in the wastewater analysis. The question is, should we decriminalise that and allow those people who are already using it, who've worked out their own dosages, to do that or not? And I think the answer is yes. But as far as the sort of scientific and medicinal dimensions of the dosage question that you ask, I'm not really qualified to say.
Thank you so much. Richard, did you want to add anything?
I just want to reiterate what was said earlier about the kind of differences between homegrown marijuana and something that you might get off an established dealer who's got a kind of pipeline with really high THC, a whole range of things. in my view, like for example, those people that might grow a few small plants at home might let one go to seed at the end of the year to get seeds for their next season or whatever. And so you've kind of got this kind of contained kind of lower level THC. When you talk to people about cannabis use, they talk about the difference between homegrown and the other things like that and the impacts of it. This will be a bit easier on you. This is homegrown. This is good. It's not as harsh. It's not as whatever term they're using to connect to it. And I think that that's something really important to consider. And that kind of alignment to alcohol, I can think of a few home brews I've had that have blown my brains out, to be perfectly honest. So if we're kind of talking about safety, we're talking about alcohol as an example of it. I'm just not sure that, although, you know, what you buy over the counter might certainly have that stuff. We can all access home brew kits. We can all kind of do that stuff and vary that as well. So you could end up with a really strong brew, or you could be someone that just likes a little bit of Nan strawberry wine. Do you know what I mean? So it's just kind of, I
that's a really good
think
point.
that things
So
are
just on that is, so there isn't a standard dosage as there would be. I'm not talking about home brew. I'm talking like if you go somewhere, they will say this is one standard drink. This is whatever. There isn't anything equivalent.
Well, I mean, I suppose I shouldn't ask this question, but I'll assume that you've never consumed cannabis. But typically, someone when they first consume cannabis homegrown, they would smoke a joint, or they would have a bong load, and usually a person will have a hit of a joint or a smoke of a bong, and then they'll sit back and they'll make an assessment. Now, some people may decide that they want more than that, and some people will decide they want less. But that is, so there is an element of art to it, and not just science. But I would say it's the same with home brew. I mean, really, it's no different. You're making something at home, and you're not sure how potent it's going to be. You have a sip and you go, whew, okay, that's got a kick to it.
And maybe if you consider kind of in the future legalising it, you might actually be able to control that amount that might be in that dose, and when you're going out to the pub or the other kind of scenarios that you're talking about. So
I have to admit that
well.
that is a substantial advantage of taking the next step and legalising.
Yeah. I think that, well, that's sort of what I was asking, is the ability. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Renee. Mr. Yali?
Thank you, Chair. And I might somewhat carry on from where the conversation was at there, and then start with you, Richard. I understand in your submission you call for more testing and more methods of testing. And I'd like to expand a bit further. What would you want that to look like in the community, particularly talking about equity, as you raised earlier?
Around?
Like equity, as in where would people be accessing the testing? What would it look like?
For HIV?
No, so for it's THC, I believe, in your
Absolutely.
submission.
Yeah. So, like pill testing, a whole range of other things. I think this kind of links back into what Renee was saying too about strength and capacity of THC and other things like that. The ability for people to kind of have that tested to see if it's okay, to see if all that stuff is available. I think that particularly issues around tests. We'd like to see more research into HIV and cannabis use and the impacts of that. I was talking earlier about the fact that, look, I'm here because of effective treatments. You know what I mean? I'm looking back and I'm seeing all of those things, but the side effects that still kind of impact people living with HIV, late diagnosis, a whole range of other things. We'd like to see more research, in particularly to HIV and cannabis, and the impacts of cannabis on HIV and other chronic illnesses as well. I think there has been a slow growth into, recognising medical cannabis and a whole range of other things, but we'd certainly like to see more effective stuff that kind of aligns with the conversations that we're having here about access to it.
Thank you. And as I think both have mentioned today, we've been talking about the sharing that goes on in the community, the gifting of quantities of cannabis, and what is already occurring out there, the reality right now in Victoria. I'll bring you in, Patrick. In terms of the quantities that we're seeing shared or gifted around in the community, what sort of scale are we talking about typically from your awareness and in terms of what's in this bill with relation to, say, small quantity, like has this bill got it right in terms of the amount of grams? Do you have a view to this?
Less than 50 grams. I mean, this bill is absolutely spot on. It's, people gift small amounts. It's a community. It's not about sale or commercial, that sort of stuff. I think Richard's description of the way the cannabis community operates was really good, and the fact that you referred to sort of the dealer with the high THC gear who's got the pipeline and the different, that's the real sort of open the trench coat kind of criminal element, right? At the moment, that I think this bill really punctures that balloon. It turns it back to being the community that it should be.
I also think the amount's right.
Okay.
Within the legislation, I think the amount's really, really generous. And like in those kind of sharing communities, you're not handing over a hay bale of this stuff. Do you know what I mean? You're handing over a couple of grams, or you're handing over a cookie, or you're sitting down and you're having a conversation about your ailments and having a joint. Do you know what I mean? So I think that it does hit the right balance there.
And so the current legislative setting that's in place and the way that people are criminalised for use and possession, given these small quantities, I mean, what impact is that having on communities, particularly communities where there's intersectional stigma that was brought up earlier?
I think it's really, it does impact people's sense of well-being. They're kind of going to do that anyway. If it's alleviating an ailment that you've got, you're going to continue to do that, whether it's a physical ailment or whether it's well-being, whether it's insomnia. We were talking about that tonight, which is one of the most common side effects of even the most recent effective treatments and other things like that. And so some of the intersectional impacts can be related more to the previous evidence from Fitzroy Legal Service. I was also here too, and talking about those intersectional things and the way that discretion is used within that. And we talk about, we extend that into broader LGBTI communities like the trans community, non-binary community. All of a sudden, because there's something that's unusual, that's different, that's challenging to deal with, that can change the way that discretion is impacted. And if something like cannabis is there, it can increase poorer outcomes for those individuals as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Keyzer, and let you come in for your contribution and also your submission. We've run out of time, but we'll definitely take this into consideration. We'll listen to our further down track.
Thank you for your time.
Chair,
Appreciate it.
Would I ask the broadcast team to dispense?